Hello from Fieldfisher in both Silicon Valley and London. I'm Robert Fett, a Senior Associate in the Silicon Valley office, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Felicity Fisher, also in Silicon Valley, and Chris Eastham in London, both partners in our International Data and Technology team. This is part of our ongoing series on issues in artificial intelligence. You can find our other AI webinars on generative AI, using machine learning for product improvement and ethics, and explainability amongst others on our YouTube channel. Search for Fieldfisher Silicon Valley. The topic of conversation today is AI governance. We know you're all excited about the AI revolution, but why should you care about how it is governed within your organization? A recent study by the IAPP found that 60% of respondents indicated that their organizations had published guidelines for the ethical use of AI, either internally or externally, and more than 50% are building responsible AI governance on top of existing mature privacy programs. So to avoid you being left behind, we're going to explore what good AI governance looks like. Not everyone will be able to achieve everything everywhere all at once, but we can at least get you thinking about what your priorities are going to be. Finally, we will summarize with some practical next steps for your ongoing AI governance journey. But before we kick off, we thought it worth tackling one of the issues that's been plaguing our LinkedIn feeds recently. Who should be taking charge of AI? And who better to ask but that great inventor, visionary of his time, and polymath extraordinaire via ChatGPT, Leonardo da Vinci? So we asked ChatGPT why Da Vinci would have been good at AI governance. And Leonardo suggesteth that to address the interplay between AI technologies, stakeholders, and potential perils, that it doth require a diverse assembly of experts from the various domains of technology, ethics, law, policy, and more. In other words, a collaboration of experts. So now that Leonardo has settled that debate, let's talk about why organizations should care about AI governance. We've seen a lot of headlines out there about the use of AI, whether that's regulations such as the EU's forthcoming AI Act and proposals in the US, Samsung banning the use of ChatGPT to prevent the leak of sensitive code, and of course the temporary ban by the Italian data protection regulator. So amongst the excitement and innovation, there are some potential pitfalls. Flick and Chris, what do you think are the biggest risks for organizations looking to leverage AI?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'm happy to kick this off. So I think AI generally presents risks that are quite different from those that companies have had to work through with other new technologies, principally because it promises to have a more substantial influence on our work and our processes. Because unlike more traditional software, it can find patterns that we can't see and then use them to provide insights and analysis, predictions, suggestions, and even full drafts of text. On its own. So for businesses, these tools offer huge opportunity in terms of boosting productivity, reducing costs, and even in some cases enhancing the customer experiences. But some of the characteristics that allow AI to quickly process large amounts of data and perform certain tasks more accurately, and in some cases more efficiently than humans can, also make it a black box. We can't see how the output was produced in many cases. And, in much of the work that we've been doing for clients, we've often tried to dig in and kind of understand how some of these model works. And it's quite apparent that even for the AI developers, it's often impossible to understand or have a full understanding of how the model reaches an outcome, or even identify all of the data points that it's using to get there, which clearly creates a number of compliance challenges and risks, and also wider ethical and social issues. And while there have been, AI has been around for a while, we've had the recent surge and breakthrough in the capabilities of AI tools. And in particular, the headline grabbing kind of rise and surge in the use of generative AI tools, which themselves present additional unique risks. So just to level set, when we're talking about Gen AI, we're really talking about a category of AI products like OpenAI's ChatGPT being the most famous and heavily used one, and image generation tools like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E 2. And these are all built on what we call large language models that are pre-trained on vast amounts of broad data using things like deep learning techniques. And these are powerful models that can perform a variety of tasks, like engaging in conversation, generating human-like text, and even writing code, which really sets them apart from more traditional AI tools that are focused, I think, on more simple tasks like analysis and classification. So a typical use case would be to provide input data and a request or prompt, which then guides the tool to produce a response. I think the power of AI introduced by these particular tools and the pressure to compete in the market has created something of an AI arms race, and everybody seems to be rushing to use or integrate these tools into their products or engineering workflows. And that's apparent from the fact that within 2 months of launching, OpenAI's ChatGPT boasted more than 100 million users. And to put that into context, Facebook, when it was created in 2004, amassed 100 million users in just 4.5 years. And at the time, that was heralded as growth that was at a speed and scale that was unprecedented. So we're really at the beginning of what feels like another technological revolution, this time with generative AI. But unlike social media, which remains to this day largely centralized, this technology is already in the hands of thousands of people, including most likely employees in your organization. And I was sort of interested to note that researchers at Stanford created a kind of clone of ChatGPT, a chatbot, for about $600. It was a model called Alpaca, and they made it open source, so it was available for download on GitHub. And by early April this year, more than 2,400 people have made their own version of it. So we're talking about extremely widespread adoption and use of these new generative AI tools. And they're rocketing ahead so quickly and so powerfully that even seasoned industry leaders here out in the Silicon Valley have been taken aback. And many have warned of the potential dangers and urging for a kind of pause on training more advanced systems. And there are also real world kind of corporate examples of how these can create massive risks for companies. In recent months, we've seen a major tech company lose 100 billion in market value due to errors caused by a chatbot. We've seen a news organization discovering errors in over 50% of its articles generated by its AI tool. And one company's AI champion, in inverted commas, chatbot had to be neutered following reports by users of unwelcome sexual advances. It all feels like an episode of Black Mirror. But these risks are real, and they warrant broader assessment and have somewhat forced the conversation around the need for more considered AI risk management and governance frameworks. And of course, the law is frantically rushing to catch up and regulate all of this. But just going back to your original question, I know Chris is going to elaborate on this, but I think one of the key risks for me is that these technologies are good, but they're not yet that good. So, AI technology is not capable of performing all the tasks that humans can, and there are many things that it does worse than the average person. So ChatGPT, for example, by learning about language patterns, has become really good at predicting which words are supposed to follow others so that it can produce seemingly sophisticated, confident text responses to pretty complicated questions. But there's a limit to the quality of these outputs, because being good at guessing plausible combinations of words and phrases is different from actually understanding the material. And large language models are statistical models of language. They're not grounded in or constrained by concepts of things like truthfulness, common sense, or rules of logic. So they're notorious for generating outputs that spread misinformation by repeating falsehoods or making up facts and citations, what we refer to as hallucinations. And the other sort of related issue is that many of these models are trained on public data sets that have been crawled and scraped. And a lot of those data sources like Reddit and Wikipedia lack sufficient mechanisms for checking the accuracy, fairness, or appropriateness of that data. So without representative training data sets, there's potential for the outputs of these models to reflect biases in their training materials. So that could potentially have legal consequences if organizations are making decisions based on those outputs, based on inaccurate or biased data inputs. And ultimately, if AI is your product and those outputs could result in an erosion of public trust in both your products and your brand. So it's all pretty serious stuff out there. But this is all really to say that companies need to carefully evaluate whether AI's strengths actually match up to the task and then proceed accordingly. So if you need to process lots of information quickly, it can do that. If you need a bunch of new ideas, they can generate them. Even if you need to make a difficult decision, it might be able to offer some advice, providing it's trained on the right data. But you probably shouldn't be using AI to create meaningful work products without some human in the loop. And the outputs that when they're derived from data sets and algorithms aren't necessarily good or accurate. So it's really about making sure that if you're developing these technologies, that you're asking as part of your approach to thinking about governance, how do we develop, apply and monitor these tools in a way that avoids worst case scenarios and has a positive impact on society? And if you're procuring these technologies and in many cases customizing them, as we've seen businesses doing with ChatGPT, you're really going to need to think about how you can design and deploy them in ways that keeps people and your company's brand safe, and importantly ensures ethical, transparent and responsible use of these technologies. So really we're talking about, careful judgment is required to determine when and how it's appropriate to use AI, and that's really sort of the impetus behind pushing this need for better AI governance in organizations. Chris, anything else to add there?
No, well, I mean, there's a huge amount in that, isn't there? And I think you've identified quite a number of the legal risks that I think we'll keep talking about. I think obviously in order to be able to identify and resolve and mitigate those risks, probably the biggest risk that sort of is almost a precedent to all of that is the lack of visibility and control. So before you can understand and start to control the various risks, you really need to know what's being done within the organization. And something that's, I think, has always been a little bit of a problem in some respects, but is going to be particularly at issue here, is that we can't simply rely on our existing processes to capture that information, because there's always going to be, whilst there'll be projects that will go through legal and sourcing, there's always going to be a variety of use cases that find their way into the organization on the basis of open source tools that are brought in by devs, or free trials, or low value credit card purchases that don't hit the triggers for review by legal and sourcing, or even just to updates that are made to existing enterprise software that's already embedded within the organization. And all of those things act as a Trojan horse to bring risk within the organizational firewall. I think in terms of the biggest legal risks, that the four key areas that sit at the top of my list right now are around confidential information leakage, IP, data privacy, and the quality. And you touched on most of those, or all of those in your introduction. Interestingly, despite all the noise in the market, I don't think regulation is actually in my top four just yet. Maybe it's number 5 or possibly number 6. Whilst we do need to be thinking about it and preparing, it's still a little way off. I mean, there are those potential fines that are being mooted of up to 6 or even 7% of global turnover under the EU AI Act. They do loom large, and we'll need to deal with those, before the Act comes in. But actually, the top spot on my list is taken by confidentiality and information leakage, particularly if we're using open loop models like the browser version of GPT. Using the API can improve the situation, but it still doesn't close off all the risks. I think you need to go further than that, to protect confidential information. The second one I mentioned was IP, particularly the variance in law and enforceability between the US, UK, and EU. In some respects, we do have quite different approaches, even though, to a degree, we sort of harmonized and enforcement is harmonized under the Berne Convention. The treatment of copyright, the subsistence of copyright in material it's created, is very different in the US as it is in the UK and EU. There are rights available in the UK and EU which aren't enforced in the US. For example, certain rights around databases which might subsist, and there's a lot of actions being taken around IP infringement at the moment in relation to generative models. So there, I think we need to keep a close eye on those. What we don't want to do is find ourselves inadvertently breaching someone else's IP or being unable to protect content that we're producing. And the fact is that these rules are complex, and the sort of cross-jurisdiction issues makes them even more so. And businesses are going to make mistakes, and they are going to get into hot water over this. So we need to be really careful about IP. The third one I mentioned is quality of output, and you covered this. Already, Flick. I think there, as you say, there are some fundamental misconceptions about what particular AI models are good at. They're not all created equal. Some are good at, developing code. Some are good at generating new ideas, but they're not all good at the same things. And depending on the field of endeavor, two ostensibly similar models can produce, outputs of widely differing quality. So we need to be really clear about what models are good and bad at, and not be fooled by the fact that what's produced looks plausible. As you say, they're not bound by the truth, and so we have to supervise them very closely. And then the fourth area is data protection, which I know that you've been thinking a lot about recently, Flick.
Yeah, so I mean, obvious point here, but training AI systems requires data and a huge amount of it. I mean, large language models are trained on terabytes of data, and a lot of that data has been scraped from the internet and publicly available data sets, using things like Common Crawl or C4. But there's a common misconception, I think, that just because data is publicly available, it's kind of a free for use. But publicly available data still presents privacy risks. It isn't outside the scope of European data protection law. And equally, there's no AI exemption from privacy laws. So when it comes to processing personal data, that you need to process for machine learning and to train your AI models. Typically under European principles, those companies who are doing that are going to be data controllers, and this means they're going to need to consider how they're going to comply with the GDPR requirements, like complying with the transparency obligations, addressing data subject rights, and establishing a legal basis for processing that data. I think another kind of area on the privacy side is that many of these AI algorithms are self-learning. They keep refining their predictive powers as they get more data and user feedback, adding new parameters along the way. And there's often no way to peer into the inner working of an AI tool and actually guarantee that the system, as I've mentioned earlier, is producing accurate or fair output. And this is somewhat in contradiction with privacy laws, as well as, frankly, trust and safety considerations, which we're going to see baked into some of the new legislation like the AI Act, which is working its way through the legislative wheel. And those kind of requirements often push for AI systems to be explainable. So the GDPR, for example, and society, frankly, can't tolerate processing that involves automated decisions about things like sentencing, credit, housing, employment, education, and other kind of life-altering areas. It doesn't tolerate those decisions being made in a black box. It's GDPR, for example, stipulates that users must be able to understand the logic of an AI tool's decisions and have the right to challenge them. And sort of figuring out how you manage those requirements creates clear challenges there. And then, we've also had this issue that researchers have discovered that through inference or leakage, these large language models may reveal sensitive data or personal data, so kind of generating new insights. And in certain cases, they can also tailor results to individual users, building profiles as they go. And again, you'll need to consider your obligations to provide transparency to the underlying data subjects when we're, processing that personal data or profiling individuals, and also consider how we're going to deliver choice to them about how their data is processed. For example, you may need to provide opt-outs for personalization or get consent to use sensitive data elements. And then a kind of big one is AI is only as good as the data it's trained on. So models that generate, for example, responses to customer support queries will produce inaccurate or out-of-date results if the content that is being used to train it is grounded in old or incomplete or inaccurate data. And as I mentioned before, this can lead to hallucinations, and you can have the tool confidently asserting a falsehood that's real. And so what we can see is this kind of perpetuation of bias, misinformation, etc. So really companies need to review their data sets and documents that they're using to train the models to make sure that they're addressing some of these issues head on. And this is not, this is also really important to establishing just compliance with basic things like data accuracy requirements under the GDPR, but also wider safety considerations. And then one other just final big flag is that when you're outsourcing or using a third-party tool like ChatGPT, it's really important to understand how the data that you're inputting into that system, how it's going to be used by that third-party vendor. Specifically, are they going to be using the data that you provide them to train their own systems to, train the underlying models? And do you really have the rights in that data? For example, if it's your own customer data, to be able to grant those third parties the rights to use the data in the inputs or prompts for those wider purposes. So really important to look at the terms that you have in place, consider the rights that you have in the data itself, and make sure that that third party is going to be adequately protecting the data that you give to them. So just a few sort of key privacy issues there. There's contractual issues, and then there's broader issues when you're a controller of the data and need to consider, your obligations around transparency, accuracy, legal basis, etc.
Thanks, Flick, and thanks, Chris, too. So which of these risks do you think should be the biggest priorities, and should that differ depending on whether you're a really nimble startup tech company versus maybe a more established player?
Yeah, I don't mind jumping on that one. So I think it will differ. I think it'll depend, I think, more on the nature of the business than its size. I think you really need to focus on those things that are going to have an impact if they go wrong. And that could be losing your IP, or it could be reputational damage through poor quality outputs. It could be data privacy impacts. But frankly, I think if you can focus on the kind of top 4 risks I just mentioned, it's probably a good place to start. I think when it comes to how you address risk and governance, it's going to differ too, and where you are in your growth life cycle probably will have an influence on that, among other factors. I want to make a point here actually that I can't really emphasize enough, and that is that when it comes to governance, that there isn't a one size fits all. It's not a one size fits all situation, and it's not going to be enough just to get a policy off a shelf and be done with it. I think those who go down that route are going to get themselves burned. The right approach to governance is going to depend on various factors, such as the sophistication of the organization in terms of governance and compliance generally, the sector in which you're operating, the markets in which you're operating, the number and degree and sophistication of the AI use cases or planned use cases. I'm currently advising clients with a wide range of maturity when it comes to AI use and governance, and they're all taking different approaches that fit their business requirements. So, for example, on the one hand, we might have a sophisticated user of AI. They've already got a number of use cases, and they're doubling down. They're doubling down on AI. They will take a very top-down, big picture approach, taking a long-term view and implementing enterprise-wide control mechanisms. On the other hand, we have those that just want to dip their toes in and see if they can get some value from just one or two low-risk use cases. Now, for them, governance is going to look quite a bit simpler. There may be mitigation measures specific to those use cases. They might have a policy here or there to prevent scope creep without appropriate oversight. But the commonality between the two is that they're being strategic about it. They've actively engaged with the issues, they've taken a decision on the approach, and then they've got a roadmap to right-size their compliance activity.
So it feels like we've seen a lot of noise about AI, and we just have so many clients at the moment asking questions. But at the moment, whilst some of the really big players like Google and Microsoft of this world, they've published some very significant materials on their AI governance practices. But other companies are very much still in the early stages, and there isn't really that much publicly available. So our listeners may be finding it difficult to sort of calibrate their own governance strategies. Given that businesses often want to sort of look at their competitors' practices and try to mirror those, Can you give a sense as to how long it's going to be before we see some more companies publishing governance materials? And is there a risk that those who wait for that to do their own benchmarking are going to be left behind?
I think that assumes that businesses will publish their approaches, and I think, in my view, actually approaches to use and governance of AI are likely to represent competitive factors and an integral part of a business's strategy and their ability to succeed in a rapidly changing world. Technological and legal change are, we're all aware those are key factors in a business's operating environment, and how we respond to those drivers can really make the difference between success and failure. So for that reason, I think that the biggest part of AI governance is going to take place behind closed doors, though naturally we'll see some aspects of it appearing in the public domain, potentially as a marketing tool. I think on that basis, my recommendation is not to wait to start tackling AI governance until you see others doing it, because actually I can tell you for a fact that they already are. And fundamentally, it's going to be much easier to set up the necessary processes and structures when AI usage is still relatively limited within your organization, and certainly in advance of governance being mandated by regulation. I think anyone that remembers the scramble to achieve GDPR compliance will know just how costly it can be to leave it until the last minute.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think some of the publicly available materials around AI governance have been published by organizations where AI is their product, and they're producing foundational models that are pretty core to a lot of other people's products. And so demonstrating that they have considered AI governance is fundamental to their sell to the customer, because we've got customers now having to think about AI governance when they build out products. So a lot of that public facing materials have been driven by the larger players out there who, again, AI is their product. So this becomes, to Chris's point, a key branding point, and also pretty fundamental to allowing their customers to consider some of the issues. So I think that's driven some of that. But I think it's also just to remember what the goal of AI governance here. It's really about embedding policies and processes to sort of drive the use, the responsible and ethical and compliant use of AI within your organizations. So it's not a window dressing exercise. It's not about publishing something on your website that is a marketing piece. It is about genuinely operationalizing policies and processes to address core risks that sit in your organization. And a lot of that wouldn't be appropriate to publish on your website. It's about guiding your workforce to understand the risks. It's about operationalizing development, policies to manage the development of AI tools in your organizations. Again, to Chris's point, one size won't fit all. It's really going to depend on what you're doing with AI and the risks, particular risks to your organizations. But yeah, don't take the fact there's not a lot publicly out there from organizations as a sign that this isn't a top level priority for organizations. There are, as I mentioned in my kind of initial comments, there are real risks here that if you're sitting on and not doing anything about, it can have wider consequences for your brand and company, including security breaches that could have clearly a big impact there. So this needs to be something that people are thinking about.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's been a lot to think about there, both across the legal and the policy spectrum. So perhaps it's going to be helpful for us to talk now about what good AI governance looks like and how a business can build a program around that.
Yeah, and I think we were sort of thinking about a scenario where you may be a kind of small team in a fast-growing company, and where do you begin with some of this? You're not the Microsoft or Google of this world with very sophisticated at this point AI governance processes. So where do we start? And I think a key starting point, and Chris mentioned this earlier, is for organizations of any size to get ahead of the situation and make sure that the use of AI systems like ChatGPT is actually understood and documented. So we know that employees are using these two tools. Your engineers may have already spun up and are using the web browser version of ChatGPT. That's their kind of free tool And you as an organization really need to understand how employees are using it, how the product teams want to incorporate it into new products moving forward. And some uses may be relatively low risk, it's just the marketing team wanting to write a press release. But others, like writing code for use in products, could involve quite complex risks that can be hard to assess. So once you have identified the current and planned uses, you can really better assess the risks and build out policies and processes that are fit for your business. And I think whilst good governance will ultimately require working with legal, security and development teams to kind of collaborate to draft a suite of policies and processes, as a really kind of bare minimum starting point, I suggest it's really critical for organizations to get ahead and make sure that you're establishing policies around how your employees are permitted to use some of these tools in the workplace, and make sure that that policy is actually implemented. So really like do's and don'ts for your employees around the use of these tools. And if you don't yet have a formal policy in place, and you know that people are using these tools, then it really is, I would even recommend that we get an urgent kind of communication out to employees about warning them about inputting, proprietary or confidential information into AI systems, or using them to do things like generate code in new products, and kind of say that they need to pause on that until a more comprehensive policy is in the works to kind of see off and head off some of that potential risk there that could be brewing, given the sort of ungoverned use of these tools by employees. And then, as you start to dig into this, it's really about capturing and maintaining a list of AI tools that are being used by your organization. You need to be checking the terms for each of them to understand how those third parties, as I mentioned, are going to use company data and the rights that you may have in the outputs, so you can start to map some of this. And I think the other really useful thing to remember is that you can also leverage and build on your existing, for example, compliance programs, your privacy programs and toolbox that you might have. That can really help inform your AI program. It's been a long-held principle of data protection law that people need to be accountable for their compliance. And privacy accountability tools like data mapping and privacy impact assessments are probably transferable to AI governance too. For example, those impact assessments that we know should be performed before deploying high-risk AI systems can be used to identify privacy risks. And those assessments can also be used to prompt your teams to think critically about AI and how to manage the risks they pose, either at the point they're introducing a new project or making changes to an existing AI project. So use the kind of review tools, the gating mechanisms you have to try and catch and understand when the business wants to use these tools, how they're using it, and make sure that you are focusing on doing risk assessments for some of those higher risk use cases. Chris, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, maybe put yourselves in the shoes just of, maybe like a larger company, because there's just so much out there, right? Like in terms of, the AI Act, the OECD principles, NIST guidelines, ISO standards, lots of guidance out there. And maybe if you were in, a much bigger, more sort of sophisticated company with, unlimited budget, which has already kind of ticked off a lot of those data protection policies and DPIAs. What would be your sort of next move?
Unlimited budget, that sounds great. So you've put on the screen there a bit of a compilation of aspects that some organizations are talking about in the public domain. And I think these are some of the pieces of the jigsaw, but they don't represent the whole picture. What you can discern from public discourse is that there's clearly this cross-disciplinary effort with input from stakeholders across legal, compliance, data, technology, ethics, business leadership, for example. And I remember when I started talking publicly about AI governance back it was about 2016, one of my key messages was the need to have that conversation between business people, technologists, lawyers, regulators, and academics. And I don't think that need has gone away. If anything, it's more pressing than ever. So we need to make sure we've got that stakeholder engagement. Over the past couple of years, I've actually developed a bit of a high-level framework that I'm using with our clients now to build a roadmap as to what AI governance might look like eventually once it's all implemented, and they can use that roadmap to implement over a period of time as their AI usage increases and as we approach D-Day for regulation, the AI Act in Europe in particular. And it all starts with accountability. Having that nominated person who's going to be accountable for AI governance, or it may be a group, maybe a committee, or some other structure. In the same way that we have a data protection officer for data, and having senior leadership buy-in, having C-suite buy-in to make sure they've got the mandate that they need in order to take the decisions, and supporting them are going to have to be those processes to enable them to make good decisions, to make sure they've got all the inputs, all the information they need. And of course, those decisions are going to have to align to the organization's ethics, the values of the organization, and the risk tolerance and appetite of the organization, balanced with the relevant business cases. So we're going to need digital ethics policies or responsible AI policies, talking about what we are and what we're not willing to do with AI, and the high level principles that we want to follow, around accountability, around transparency, around putting doing things for the social good and for the good of people, and all those good things. And that's going to have to inform our development methodologies, our procurement approaches, our strategic acquisitions, and our customer terms and the relationships we have with our customers, as well as the flow down terms that flow off all of that. So, codes of conduct for vendors, carefully crafted customer terms, DD questions, and warranties for corporate acquisition. And we're also going to need an established risk approach for the business, both for internal and external use of AI, and looking at different use cases. And then incident management processes as well, addressing what will happen when things go wrong. And it's also going to be really important to ensure that our use of AI is in line with ethical values I've mentioned. So that's all going to have to be tied together within the process. We're going to have to look at data governance really carefully. And I don't just mean data privacy here. We need to be able to assure the training data and the input data. We need to look at it very carefully and make sure that we can eliminate unwanted bias, and we can assure the quality of the data and have traceability, to make sure that we're making good AI models, because ultimately, we've all heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out. We need supervision as well. So we're going to need suitable mechanisms to supervise these AI use cases. That doesn't necessarily mean, human in the loop, but having someone that's responsible for a particular AI use case, and making sure that as it changes, we keep our documentation up to date, we keep our impact assessments up to date. Cyber is going to be a real risk as well. And I was talking to a cyber expert at a conference just 2 weeks ago, and he was saying that if you want to fully secure an AI model up to industry best practice, you're talking potentially about 6 figures, right? If you're developing a model and then seeking to secure it. So cyber is not an easy task, and we need to make sure that we're on top of that. So that will include not just securing the models, but also updating our information security policies, looking again at cyber risk insurance, and seeing what we can do in terms of mitigation strategies there. Because ultimately, introducing an AI, we're going to be introducing new vulnerabilities into the organization's IT systems. Ultimately, I think we're going to need some way of tracking all of this. So an AI catalog is probably going to be helpful to manage and track the business's AI assets and record the regulatory status of AI systems, and make sure that we've got all the documents associated with the AI systems in one place, so that we've got that auditability. So all the explainability statements, DPIAs, impact assessments for each AI system, balanced with the business case, so that we can see why decisions were made in a particular way, and we can go back and we can, we've got the auditability there. And of course, any specific mechanisms that are going to be required to enable compliance with the AI Act, should that apply to you, and any other requirements from federal agencies in the US and sectoral regulators in the UK and elsewhere. There may well be requirements to certify AI systems. We're going to see standards coming in, and I think all of that, we're going to need ways of complying and tracking all of that. But it's worth saying that these can't be static processes. Ultimately, they're going to have to account for change, not only of the AI itself, but of the input data it's processing, and the context in which it's being used. So there's a fair amount to do, but I think we've got a little bit of time to get it right.
Thanks, Chris. So I think we've had a really fruitful discussion on the risks of AI and how to balance them with innovation and available resources. So we can probably boil this down into just a few thoughts for you to take away. So the first is, you need to deal with your immediate risks first. If your kids are using AI to do their homework, then for sure, so are your employees. The second is to work out how you're going to be using AI. So we've seen time and again how companies don't use consistent language between their sales, product, engineering, and legal teams. So trying to document what you're doing and all sing from the same page is really helpful. There's a strong relationship to data mapping here as well. So try to leverage and build on that process. But also, to understand what the products are and what's already out there with customers. But you also need to think about what your engineering teams are working on for the next quarter, next year, and even beyond that. Also have a think about what research projects your engineering team, your product team have on the go, and that also might give you a steer as to kind of what's coming down the pipeline and what goals the business have in the long term. Oftentimes we've seen that the business will only talk about their immediate next steps and try to get legal advice on that. But just try to get them to open up a little bit more about their hopes and dreams, and this can perhaps help you to accurately calibrate your risk profile. The third thought is, as you begin to understand your products more, you'll get a better sense of where the risks actually lie. So is it the IP, is that your primary concern, or is it more like the accuracy of your AI outputs? Or perhaps you're in the medical or financial fields where the data protection issues may be more acute. At this stage, and after getting to know your business better, you'll have a good idea of who the stakeholders are, and you can assemble a team that reflects what is important to you both internally to keep your business innovative, but also a team that's going to help you to lead or support on risk mitigation. And it's likely that this is going to encompass a really wide variety of stakeholders across the business, whether that's IP, data, commercial, product, engineering, public policy, PR. There's really a lot of people in the organization that are going to be able to help you. Next, put some guardrails around how you're using AI, and but also, of course, balancing that with not compromising the business. And these guardrails can, of course, evolve as your AI governance becomes deeper and more sophisticated. And finally, and some of this can be done in parallel with the other steps, talk about putting together some internal policies, some risk assessments, and other external facing documentation which supports your AI governance. So thanks everybody for listening. We have a really broad interdisciplinary team here of experts who can help you to build your AI governance strategy, whether your focus is data, IP, or commercial. You're in a specialist industry here, and particularly if you're thinking about, finance or medical devices, which are really complex, we're definitely here to help. So get in touch with your questions. We're going to be having another webinar soon on privacy enhancing technologies, and fingers crossed, there'll also be a bonus webinar on the Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework as soon as that is finalized by the US and the EU Commission. So look out for that. But otherwise, thank you for listening to us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.